To go deeper into our episodes, please visit the show notes in your podcast app. Or to get a fuller unedited experience, go find this episode on spotlightonpodcast.com. There, the notes are packed with links to resources that give you more about the people and topics explored here. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a podcast featuring the musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping media, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on composer and percussionist Shawn Mativetsky, a renowned tabla player. Shawn's a pioneer in bridging the worlds of Western and Indian classical musics. We discuss the intricacies of traditional Indian music, including the setup and tuning of the instruments, the guru-disciple relationship, and the reception of Western musicians in the Hindustani community. We also explore the importance of deep learning, consistent practice, and research in the mastering of a musical instrument, with Shawn sharing his personal journey and his commitment to the craft. Shawn and I spoke much earlier this year around the April release of his album Temporal Waves, which we will link to in the show notes. And now, Shawn Mativetsky. For the benefit of our listeners, Shawn is sitting in front of an amazing collection of instruments. Are all of the instruments behind you tabla?
Yeah, and there's two more shelves that you don't see.
Wow. So what is the significance of that? Is it a tuning thing, or could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Tabla is a tuned instrument, as you said. So depending on the key of the piece, you need a different pitch. And tabla really is made for a specific note. You can modify it a little bit. You can go down maybe a tone or so, like one note, and it'll still sound okay. But if you go outside of the range, it doesn't really sound good anymore. So over time, it's not like I got all those in one day. Usually we start with like a C pitch, and then maybe, I should get a D, and then, it might be nice to have an A flat. And then it's sometimes handy to have two of the same pitch in case something happens. I'm not in India, I'm in Canada. So you need to have backups, right? Doubles of some of the more common pitches that I use more often. And so, yeah, over the years, things accumulate a little bit.
Are they tuned to the Western scale, or are they microtones, or how does that work?
In the traditional context, you tune to whatever the other musician, their instrument, where it sounds. So if I'm accompanying sitar, some sitarists will tune D on an A440 basis, like a regular D. Some will use A432 or some other tuning, not without any reference. Like they may just tune their instrument. It sounds good there, and then I tune to them. Musicians who are doing more like cross-cultural collaborations will tend to tune on regular 440. And also a lot of musicians now are using like apps for the drone, for the tanpura drone that you hear in performances. And so when you're using the app, it tends to be in 440. You can move it, of course, but just for simplicity, most musicians now are just basically sticking to the Western pitches mainly. But otherwise, within the scale of a raga, it's natural tuning. But for the tabla, because we're only tuning one note, really, we're only concerned with the first note and not the other intervals after that.
Gotcha. I know we're here to talk about your latest project, Temporal Waves, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about the development and journey of especially a young percussionist. I'm so fascinated by what I'm perceiving as a little bit of a unique journey to your instrument because I'm perceiving you as a unique player of your instrument. I would love it if you could tell me a little bit about where did you start? Were you the kind of kid were you faced with piano lessons, or did you originally play a trap drum set? How did you end up where you are now?
In elementary school, music class was just singing. Like the teacher would play piano and we would sing songs along with that. And sometimes other kids in the class would come in with like a lute or a guitar, or they would play something for the class. And then so I started to get the idea, I would like to learn an instrument too. So my parents called the local music shop and read off what classes they had there. Clarinet, flute, organ, piano, drums, none of it. Oh, drums, that sounds like fun. Looking back, it feels like a kind of random choice, but I'm sure it wasn't that, I must have had some tendencies towards banging on pots and pans and things like that.
Yeah.
So at 7, I started with drums, lessons, reading music. And then I continued with drum kit. And in high school, I played in the concert band and all that. So I picked up on some Western classical percussion. And then when I was around like 17, I heard tabla for the first time. And I was just like blown away immediately. Like, wow, what is this? What's this amazing sound? And it wasn't Indian traditional music. It was some fusion recording. And I looked in the CD liner notes and I went through all the instruments and I knew what they all were. Just there was something called tabla that I didn't know. So just by process of elimination, that really cool sound that I heard, that must be tabla because this is pre-internet. I went to the library, found out, okay, this is some drums from India and etc. So I went and bought a set of tabla and I'm like, I'll be able to figure this out, no problem. And I sat down on the floor with my brother and we're hitting the drums in all kinds of different ways and nothing sounded at all like what we heard in the recording, just no chance. Then I understood I had to find a teacher. So I had a few lessons with one person. He got me started, maybe just 5 lessons or so, really not much. And then I had to find another teacher and then I studied with him for a couple of years. It was one percussion instrument amongst many, but I would integrate it into my schooling however I could, whether it was like open projects or I was trying to find pieces by composers written for tabla, but I would play whatever I could get my hands on. So kind of baby steps, I started going to Toronto to study with Bob Becker, who's a very well-known Western classical percussionist, but who also achieved a very high level on tabla. He said from the beginning, I'll teach you, but you should go see my guru, like his guru, as soon as you can.
Wow.
But when I studied with Bob, like I studied with him for 5 years. And then finally I had the chance to meet his guru, Pandit Sharda Sahai, who became my guru. And I studied with him until he passed away at the end of 2011. And still, all through this time, I'm continuing the Western classical percussion and taking gigs with orchestras and tabla always remaining my favorite instrument, but never thinking I could be necessarily a tabla player. I wasn't born in this culture, but I just kept at it and I kept studying and practicing. And then I started getting called more for someone needed a tabla player and they would call me and it started to happen more and more. And so the styles of music the contexts are very varied, but the tabla is really my instrument. This is like my daily, like my whole life revolves around this instrument. So I've been, very lucky, very fortunate to have had, first of all, an amazing teacher. And somehow through a bit of luck and circumstance and that this path came before me and that I'm able to earn a living as a tabla player somehow.
So it looks deceptively simple. Not simple to play necessarily, but it's 2 drum heads and 2 bowls, and yet there's a lifetime of study behind what you do. Could you articulate a little bit about what does study mean in the context of this drum? How far can you go?
I still have to determine that last part. It's really infinite. The idea is to first find a teacher. It's really not an instrument that you can learn from books or that you can learn from YouTube videos. It's really when you become a disciple of a guru, like becoming an apprentice of a master, you enter into a commitment to each other, a long-term commitment. And so the idea is you don't change teachers. It's very different from in the Western tradition where you study with many people. So once you enter into this formal relationship, that's your teacher for life. You see your teacher as much as you can, really as often as you can and for how long as you can. So for me, I would go to see my guru. Usually it was 3 times a year for 3 weeks to a month each time. And then every day we see each other, right? Not once a week, right? It's every day. Go in the morning. He's practicing already. No matter how early in the morning I went, he was practicing. I would sit down, try to keep up with him for 2 or 3 hours. This was just his morning warm-up routine. Then maybe he would give me a lesson. Then we'd have lunch together. Then after lunch, if I didn't have a lesson, I'd have a lesson then. Or if I had a lesson in the morning, he would say, go practice. Maybe we watch TV together, lots of like daily things, right? Not just musical things, like going grocery shopping, going to the post office, going to doctor's appointments, going regular stuff. So it's the music, it's learning the music, but it's learning much more than that, really learning about all aspects of life from a professional standpoint. Let's say he had a concert. Of course, as students, we carry the instrument for him, this kind of thing. But at the same time, it's like hang out backstage, see his pre-concert routine, see the interactions with the sound technician, how he goes about getting the sound he wants, the sound check, all the preparations that go into the concert, all the behind the scenes stuff. It's really like a full education, not just how to play the instrument, but all that goes around in the profession and also just aspects of life. It's a very deep relationship. It's really like becoming a member of the family, and then you're together as much as you possibly can be.
If you were a student growing up in Northern India and you had a guru, would you live with them?
So some teachers do that, some teachers don't. Back in the olden days, it was like that, but otherwise you would usually live somewhat close to them. You don't have to necessarily live there, but you would go to their house every day. So my guru, he split his year. He was mostly living in London, England, and in wintertime, he would go back to Banaras, or Varanasi as it's known now. In his neighborhood in Varanasi, it's Kabir Chora, which is a traditional musician and dancers neighborhood. And you just walk through the little alleys, and everywhere you turn, you can hear music being practiced. You hear someone singing, or you hear sarangi, you hear tabla, you hear dancers with their gunguru, their bells around their ankles, just walking all through the neighborhood, because it's all musician families and musician houses, like very traditional artists' neighborhood. And maybe you're not living with your guru necessarily, but you're just like down the street from them, around the corner, or this kind of thing.
Yeah, sort of a replication or a sort of metaphor of like a village life or a...
Mm-hmm.
What is the term? Is Pandit an honorific or a title? What does that word mean?
Yeah, so Pandit, there's Pandit and Ustad. Pandit is the kind of a title given to Hindu musicians, and Ustad is the title given to Muslim musicians. It's basically like maestro. If you become a well-known, respected musician, people start to call you that. So you can imagine a transitionary period, maybe where some people might be calling you Pandit and some people are not. And then eventually maybe it sticks because you've become a respected musician. So yeah, it's not like a formal certificate or degree or something like that, but it's, like I say, it's similar in a way to maestro. It's a term of respect.
Did you encounter like cultural resistance? Is the community of Hindustani musicians excited about having a Western student or a Western face amongst them? Or was there an element of appropriation or bad vibes at all or anything like that?
It's funny because in my guru's family and community, whether in London or back in India and Benares, people were so welcoming and so happy that, wow, someone from outside our culture is so interested and so serious about the music. Look at all the time he's putting in. Look at all these trips he's making. It was seen as a very positive thing. So I was very welcomed. Sometimes I hear comments from people within the South Asian community, like our kids aren't interested in this music, like the classical music. It's not popular music. But look, you're not even from this culture and you're devoting your entire life to it.
Yeah.
Where the questions of cultural appropriation, these kinds of like skepticisms maybe come out, it's more outside of India that these kinds of things happen. Like I accompany an Indian dancer, and sometimes when she books a show, they're like, oh, is this really the tabla player you want? And she's like, yeah, he knows my repertoire and I know I can count on him.
Mm.
And I think it's normal because there are people who don't follow the tradition, who haven't immersed themselves enough, and they're making missteps without knowing that they're making missteps. And so I can understand the need to maybe prove myself and this kind of thing. Like, that's okay, because there are people misrepresenting themselves, unfortunately. So for example, like in the tradition, you need your guru or your teacher's permission before you take professional engagements. So before you start performing publicly, you need permission. Before you start teaching, you need permission. But a lot of people don't know that, the tradition, right? Like from outside the culture, they don't necessarily know. I've seen someone gone to India for 6 months and then come back and start teaching.
Wow.
Usually when people ask me, how long does it take to be able to play tabla? I say, after 10 years, you become a beginner. So it's like 6 months, I don't know what this person's teaching. It's a very long-term commitment. And for, how long I've been playing tabla, it's around 30 years at this point. I still feel like I don't know very much, and that I have, many more years of practice and absorbing of the material that my guru taught to me to be able to really do justice to it. It's a never ending thing. And you're always hearing things and seeing things like from a new angle, a new way. You're always learning something new all the time without necessarily learning like new compositions. It's not about amassing of repertoire, going deep with what you have, because some of them are fixed compositions and you play them just as they are. And others, they're seeds for improvisation. What ideas can you come up with to improvise on that theme? How far can you go with it? So there's always some new discovery, some new thing. Or you go to a concert and someone else plays that composition in a new way. Oh, I never thought of it that way before. And yeah, there's always something new.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. SpotlightOnPodcast.com/store is the place to go to get a Spotlight On collectible for the music and arts lover in your life, or maybe even yourself. Go to SpotlightOnPodcast.com/store today. And now, back to Spotlight On. It's really fascinating because, again, as a listener and as a recreational user of the music, it is such a powerful and unique instrument. Given the deceptive simplicity of the instrument, what's the initial hurdle to being able to create sound? What's the first lesson that you have to learn?
So for a lot of people, it's literally just to be able to sit for a long time.
Yeah.
And there's old stories of like gurus who would make their students just sit for 2-3 hours before they would teach them anything. I haven't witnessed that myself, but there are stories like that. We need to practice at first an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day. Later, when it becomes more serious, we're practicing 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day, this kind of thing. How can you practice 6 hours in the day if you can't sit for 6 hours in the day, right? So that for some people, that is literally a hurdle. But really, just to be able to make a nice sound takes time. We do a lot of practicing of phrases, so short phrases that we repeat, and then we increase the speed. It requires a lot of repetitive focus practice, many hours, many years.
Wow.
When you feel the music, you don't feel it like a chore, right? It's something you want to do and you enjoy doing it, right? The enjoyment is there. And that's the thing too, is that in my case, what drew me to the instrument was the sound of the instrument. So as you hear the sound improving, then your enjoyment is increasing as well, right? Because you're getting that sound that you've been longing for, that got you interested.
Yeah.
The other challenge is the speed. And that also takes time. I mean, like learning anything, I think at first you have a lot of improvement really quickly. And then as you get better, the improvement slows down, right? And you have to do these marathon practice sessions just to inch up that little bit faster or that little bit clearer. Some of that kind of practice we do in groups too. It doesn't have to be alone, but certain kind of practice, of course, any kind of nuanced practice you have to do alone.
Is there any repertoire for tabla as an ensemble, or is it always an accompaniment instrument?
So it's funny. So I teach at McGill University and we do have a tabla ensemble there, but it's not a traditional thing. So either tabla is an accompaniment instrument or tabla can be a solo instrument as well. And the bulk of what we learn in tabla lessons is the solo repertoire, right? So, it's kind of a byproduct of a group class. If you have group tabla class and then you want to have a class concert, if you want to have a duo or trio of tabla players playing together, but really it's solo repertoire that's being played as a group.
At McGill, are you in the context of a ethnomusicology department, or like what's the program that you're in, that you teach in?
No, for me, I teach it in lots of different things, but mainly performance. I fit in the percussion department, which is part of the Western classical, because basically we have Western classical and jazz. There is musicology, ethnomusicology we do have, but it's smaller. But I teach other classes. I teach Indian rhythm class. I teach for the music education area. I teach lots of different kinds of things.
I've been doing this podcast now for several years. I've talked to a couple of hundred guests and artists. And it's only been in the last couple of weeks that I realized that what I see in the biography of a lot of music artists that I talk with is they use the word research for their work. Could you shed any light into that? Do you think of your practice or your work as research?
So when you're creating new music, like for Temporal Waves, I had to go through a process of exploration. I had to go through a process of learning, working with analog synthesizers and creating sounds. And like, that's research. Research is not just reading in books and things like that, but research, it's information, but it's also experimentation, exploration. That's also part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can be research in like reading about things, different kinds of interpretation. That's research. Listening to performances to inform ours. That's research. I mean, there's lots of different ways of looking at it.
When you embarked upon the beginning of the work for Temporal Waves, did you have a concept in mind, or what journey did you go on in the making of this record?
Research. No.
All right. Thanks for being here.
I mean, it was really, I wanted to get back to something I had been doing in the 90s, but from a different angle. In the 90s, I was doing electronic music as a serious hobby. I was involved in the tracker scene, which is an early way of making music with computers. And I started to get into synthesizers back then too, but it was a hobby. It was not part of my professional music making. And so I set that aside for many years. And like the pandemic gave us all a bit of a pause, time to reflect. What would I like to do next? And another aspect that came out in the pandemic was kind of the sense of comfort, nostalgia. And there's a comfort aspect to nostalgia, thinking about youth and these kind of things. So reminiscing about these things, that the electronics, growing up with Atari, Nintendo, these things, at the same time, shows like Stranger Things and that kind of bringing back these kind of like retro 80s, 90s vibes. And it's like, I would like to revisit electronics, but now I was seeing something that I didn't see before. I was seeing it now as I can integrate tabla with this. Like I was seeing it from a very different perspective now. Electronic was technological and cold. And now, like reminiscing these nostalgic sounds, it makes the electronic sounds warm.
Yeah.
Now I saw how the tabla could connect, because the tabla also has a very warm, organic sound. Now, I didn't necessarily have the concept. I didn't know that the music was going to be a kind of maybe ambient experimental synth wave. I'm not sure what label to put on it. People hear it differently. Obviously, it doesn't sound like Indian music on the surface, other than that the tabla is there. It's really, it fits, it's electronic music. But I got a research grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. I started buying guitar pedals, processing the tabla through pedals and seeing what kind of different things I could come up with. So this was more improvisatory, more free. And I got some synthesizers and started to play with that. And then it became more clear kind of what was going on and more of a connection from piece to piece. So even going into the studio to record, not all the pieces were composed. The interludes, right, on the album, those were like processes of experimentation in the studio. I had the ideas, but I didn't have the equipment or all the expertise. So I really needed Jay Lesek, who was the engineer. He did the mixing. He was the co-producer. I needed his help to make these things happen. So I went in with ideas, but fortunately, we had the time in the studio that we could try things. We actually had time to do some experimentation in the studio and create. So that's like a luxury that usually we don't have.
What will the live presentation of this music look like?
So definitely all the tabla I would play. And when there's not tabla, I would be playing synthesizers. And then I would have to rely on some pre-recorded things for a couple of reasons. I could bring a bunch of synthesizers and have them be sequenced live. But on a technical level or a logistic level, touring with that amount of synthesizers, even though I'm sure people would love to see them all, it would be very difficult to travel with. The setup time would be big. So things break down. The other reason, though, for the backing tracks is a lot of the effects would require me to have all kinds of tape machines with me. And again, while I'm sure the audience would love to see that gear, like I would love to see that gear, some of these effects like that are made in studio, it's very hard to reproduce them reliably live. So yeah, tabla, some synths that I would play. I would also be using some guitar effects pedals for live processing of the tabla sound, live processing of the synthesizer sound. The dream would be to have two people with me that could actually be playing the synths so that it's all being produced live. I'm a performing musician, so I appreciate, to be playing with other people and have that interaction on stage, and that everything that you hear is actually being played by someone.
What's the environment you'd like to perform this music in, or the type of room? Is it a jazz club? Is it a rock club? Is it a warehouse? Do you think about that at all?
One of the main goals of this project, aside from the musical inspiration, was to bring tabla to new audiences. And I'm seeing that already. I've been hanging out with some people in the synthwave scene online. A lot of people are hearing tabla for the first time, and that's great. And they're hearing it in a new way. And so I'm very happy about that, because that's really one of my goals in general, is just to spread awareness of the instrument and of the tradition. So even though in this context, you're hearing the tabla in a completely non-traditional way, if I can open the door for people, as a kind of gateway into the tabla or into Indian classical music, that would make me very happy. I think that this music can take place in lots of different places, from like the traditional concert hall to, like pop and indie music festivals.
Yeah.
And also something I want to develop is video projections to go along with it. Because for me, this music, I see it as kind of very like cinematic, and you can imagine things, right, as you're listening to it. For me anyway, it evokes different imagery, and I would like the titles of the pieces. I'm maybe imposing certain imagery, but, retro future sci-fi things.
Yeah, it's interesting that you touch on that. I've had conversations with other artists, and the theme or the idea that seems to emerge, or that we all circle around, is that there seems to be something very specific about the transition of the analog into the digital. And I think it applies to audio and video technology. You think about the cathode ray video, the way it's manifest on your album cover even. There's something about that aesthetic that seems to resonate with people, and where the digital instruments and the analog instruments and the human players, that mixture of the mechanical and the human, before it was so perfect with digital, there's something very like special about that combination.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things. So one about the kind of the CRT and my album cover, I actually almost put a CRT overlay on that image so that it would have looked like it was on an old TV, but I decided not to do that because I didn't want to distort the artwork of Baran Sarper. He's a Turkish digital artist, and his artwork is so detailed. I didn't want to mess with it.
Yeah.
And the idea of digital, we were recording things on cassette tape, 4-track recorders, these kinds of things. And we went to digital recording and then CD quality and all these things. And we were just trying to make everything as pristine and perfect as possible. And now recording, like 24-bit, 96 kilohertz, super perfect, super crisp. In a way, it's like older, like analog technology and the CRT and VHS and reel-to-reel and all these things. For me, it brings these little human imperfections into, so it just gives something special to the sound, it makes us think of this old equipment, these things that were not perfect, this imperfect technology, and it connects back to that time, And there's just something about guitar pedals, synthesizers, the hands-on nature of it. Right. And it's an instrument itself. You have knobs and sliders, and you turn the knob and something happens, right? Like you move the slider and something happens. It's something very complex, and it's something very simple at the same time.
Given the amount of commitment you've made with teachers and your specific teacher for so long, what did you come away with from that experience as a student that's made you a better or more sensitive teacher?
One is the personal aspect. But I think, all teachers care about their students. I think that's normal. The oral tradition had a big impact on me. Students don't always like this, but I don't tend to write on the board, because it's more when you're teaching or learning with oral tradition, you need to be present, right? You need to be there in the moment, listening, observing. And sometimes when things, if you give handouts and things like that, then you don't have to be fully present. So when we're teaching, I'm not sitting in the corner with my arms crossed. We're sitting across from each other playing together, right? Sometimes you do have to explain things and you have to answer questions and things like that. And that's totally fine. So that's where my Western background, questions are okay. Taking notes, it's okay. But like traditionally on the Indian classical side, it's like, don't ask questions, don't take notes. That it's different. And playing together, I think just playing together is such an important thing. And for me, that's very important. So don't just talk about doing it, actually do it and doing it together.
Thank you so much, Shawn Mativetsky. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson, with editing and sound design by Terry Graham. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, ongoing postings on our official blog, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support this work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.